The Duke offered her a contract marriage. She added one unexpected condition: a story. Eleanor Voss arrived at the Duke of Ashford's estate the way most women arrived at places they had not chosen, with a straight back, quiet hands, and absolutely no idea what was about to happen to her life. She had known, of course, that something was going to happen. She had received the letter 4 days earlier, written in a solicitor's careful hand, requesting her presence at Ashford Hall on Tuesday the 14th at the hour of 2 in the afternoon, regarding a matter of mutual benefit. She had read the letter 3 times. She had understood it perfectly. She had still had no idea what was about to happen to her life, because understanding words on paper and being prepared for what they meant when they became real are two very different things. And Eleanor had spent enough of her years learning that particular lesson that she was no longer surprised by it. It was October. The sky above the Ashford grounds was the pale, washed-out gray of old linen, left too long near a window, and the gravel beneath the carriage wheels made a sound like something being slowly and methodically reduced to its smallest parts. Eleanor noticed the sound. She noticed most sounds, most small details. It was a habit she had developed during her first marriage, when paying close attention to small things: the particular quality of a silence, the angle of a door left an inch too far open, the way a person set down a cup when they were pleased, as opposed to when they were not, had been the only reliable way she had of knowing whether a day was going to be ordinary difficult or the other kind. She was 27 years old. She had been a widow for 14 months. She had, by her own careful accounting, enough money to carry her through the winter if she was careful with the coal and did not have any unexpected expenses. A small room above her cousin Margaret's house in Bath, and a very clear and unflinching understanding of what her situation was, and what, without intervention of some kind, it was likely to become. She was not the kind of woman who allowed herself comfortable pretending. She had tried comfortable pretending once. It had not worked out, and the cost of finding that out had been the kind of cost you paid with years rather than money. The carriage stopped. The door opened. A young footman in the Ashford livery stood back to offer his hand. Eleanor stepped down without taking it. She was not going to arrive at this house needing help to get out of a carriage. She was going to arrive under her own power, and she was going to remain under her own power for as long as it was physically possible to do so, which was a principle she held regarding carriages and also, she supposed, everything else. She stood on the gravel for a moment and looked at the house. It was enormous. It was, she thought, the kind of house that had been built by people for whom the statement, "I live here," was the most important thing about them. People who needed the building to announce that fact before they had to say a word. 3 generations of Ashfords had added to it. A west wing here, a new tower there, a gallery running along the south side that connected 2 parts of the building that had not previously required connecting. And the result was something that was not quite one thing or another, too large to feel intimate, and too disorganized in its grandeur to feel purely formal. It looked, Eleanor thought, rather like a place that was still trying to decide what it wanted to be. She picked up her bag and went inside. The butler was a tall, very thin man named Graves, who had the quality of a person who had spent so long being professional that the professionalism had become indistinguishable from the person. He led her through a hallway with black and white floor tiles, then another hallway with dark wood paneling and a smell of old flowers and beeswax, then a long gallery in which a series of Ashfords looked down at her from heavy gold frames with varying degrees of interest. She looked back at them as she passed. Some of them had kind faces. Some of them had faces that were simply expensive. Graves stopped before a door on the 2nd floor of the east wing. He knocked twice, evenly, in the manner of someone who had knocked on this door many hundreds of times and had never knocked incorrectly. He waited 2 seconds, then opened the door and stood aside. Eleanor walked in. The study was large, but not large in the way the rest of the house was large. It did not seem to be making any particular argument about itself. Books covered 3 walls, from floor to ceiling, and she could tell immediately that they were real books, books that had been opened and read and opened again, because many of them had their spines creased and several had small slips of paper or folded notes tucked between their pages at various angles. A fire burned in the hearth on the left side of the room, doing its work steadily and without drama. The desk in the center of the room was old and very large, and covered with papers arranged in a way that looked like organized chaos to a stranger, and almost certainly had an internal logic that was entirely clear to the person who had arranged them. A window behind the desk admitted the flat gray October light and looked out over what appeared, from this angle, to be the East Garden. Behind the desk sat Callum Ashford, 5th Duke of Ashford, who was 34 years old, and who had apparently not gotten the letter reminding him that a guest was arriving, because he was still reading something and did not look up immediately. Eleanor stood still. He finished what he was reading, set the paper down with a particular kind of deliberateness that told her he had been aware of her arrival and had simply chosen to finish the sentence, and then looked up. She looked back at him and took a rapid, thorough inventory of the kind she had become very good at over the years. He was not handsome in the classical sense. His face had too many strong angles for classical handsomeness, the jaw too definite, the forehead too broad, the nose slightly imperfect. He was built solidly, which was visible even behind a desk, and he wore his clothes the way a person wears clothes they have not thought about that morning, which meant either that he did not care about appearance or that he was so accustomed to being appropriately dressed that it no longer required any thought. His hair was dark, with the first traces of gray beginning at the temples, which on him looked less like aging and more like something that had been there from the start. His eyes, from across the room, were a color she could not immediately determine. He was the kind of man who, she thought, had probably caused a great deal of difficulty for a great many people without ever raising his voice. She noted this the way she noted weather, as useful information, not as anything she intended to act upon. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, with a quality she associated with men who had spent a great deal of their lives being listened to and had never needed to perform in order to earn that. "Mrs. Voss," she said, sitting down in the chair across from his desk. She had not been invited to sit, but she was not going to stand in the center of this room, being looked at as if she were a piece of furniture that had not yet been assigned a room. He paused. It was a very small pause, barely a pause at all, but Eleanor had spent years developing sensitivity to the pauses that people made, and she caught it. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "thank you for making the journey from Bath. You made it fairly clear in your letter that not making the journey was not an available option," she said. He looked at her for a moment. She could not tell whether he found this impertinent or simply accurate. "I did not intend it to read that way," he said. "It read that way," she said. Another small pause. "I will take that into account in future correspondence," he said. "You said in your letter," Eleanor said, "that this meeting concerned a matter of mutual benefit. I have thought about what that phrase might mean for 4 days, and I have arrived at approximately 3 possible interpretations. I am going to assume that the most direct and significant of them is correct, because that is usually how these things work, and I would prefer that we speak plainly rather than circling around it." He looked at her for a moment that was slightly longer than the previous ones. Then he folded his hands on the desk and spoke very plainly. "I require a wife," he said, "not a romantic partner. A capable woman who can manage a large household, who is intelligent, who is not interested in society for its own sake, and who can maintain the appropriate public appearance of a marriage, without requiring that it be something it is not. You require financial security, a stable home, and an arrangement that gives you genuine authority over your own circumstances, rather than merely the appearance of it." He paused. "I believe we can be of use to each other. I do not think pretending it is something else would serve either of us." Eleanor held his gaze. "How do you know what I require?" She said. "I made inquiries," he said, "through appropriate channels. I know your circumstances, broadly speaking. I know your history, insofar as it is a matter of public record. And insofar as it is not a matter of public record," he met her eyes. "I did not inquire further than was appropriate," he said. She believed him. She was not entirely certain why, except that the way he said it suggested he was the kind of man for whom the boundaries of appropriate and inappropriate were not particularly fluid, and that he had more respect for those boundaries than he had curiosity about what was on the other side of them. He reached into the left-hand drawer of his desk and produced a document, perhaps 12 pages, bound with a narrow black cord, the pages stacked neatly and in order. He set it on the desk between them and moved it slightly toward her. Eleanor picked it up and began to read. She read it once. Then she read it again. Then she read it a third time, going more slowly on the passages that required more careful attention. She did this because she had made the mistake of trusting words spoken aloud exactly once in her life, and the education she had received from that mistake had been thorough and lasting. The contract was, she had to admit, genuinely good. Not good in the way of something written to benefit one party at the expense of the other, while pretending to be balanced. She had seen those, and they had a particular quality of careful language that was designed to look generous while saying the opposite. This was good in the way of something written by someone who had sat down and asked what would actually be fair, and then tried to write that. Clause 1 established the nature of the arrangement: practical, mutually beneficial, not romantic, not based on any misrepresentation of feeling. Clause 2 outlined her responsibilities: managing the household at Ashford Hall, the townhouse in London, and a smaller property in Scotland. Clause 3 addressed the matter of an heir, with careful language about timing and mutual agreement. Clause 4 was the allowance, which was, she noted with genuine surprise, not merely adequate, but genuinely, substantially generous. The kind of generosity that suggested he had thought about what financial security actually looked like, rather than what it looked like from the outside. Clause 5 limited her required social appearances to 6 per year. Clause 6 confirmed separate bedrooms. Clause 7 specified that neither party was to interfere in the private affairs of the other, so long as those affairs did not bring harm to the family's reputation. Clause 8 dealt with her provision in the event of his death, and it was also generous: the London townhouse for life, and a settlement that would ensure she was genuinely independent. Clauses 9 through 12 covered the operational specifics: the household staff and their management chain, the financial accounts and her authority over household expenditure, the timeline for the requirements of Clause 3, and the process for legal disputes should any arise. Eleanor read each clause carefully. She read the footnotes. She read the definitions section at the back. The Duke sat across from her and waited. He was remarkably good at waiting. He did not fill the silence with small sounds or small movements. He did not shift in his chair or pick up a pen and put it down again. He simply sat and let her read, and there was something in the quality of his stillness that was not impatience suppressed, but simply the natural state of a man who knew that some things took time and had no argument with that. When she finally set the document back on the desk, he looked at her. "Your solicitor drafted this," she said. "My solicitor and I drafted it together," he said. "The structure is his. The substance is mine." She looked at the document. She looked at him. "It is fair," she said. Something shifted in his expression. It was not surprise, exactly. It was more like the relaxation of something that had been held in anticipation of a difficulty that had not arrived. "I intended it to be," he said. "Clause 4, she said. He waited. "The allowance is more than adequate. It is what I would want if our positions were reversed," he said. "Money that is available but insufficient creates a different kind of dependency than money that is genuinely adequate. I did not want to create a situation where you were technically provided for, but practically dependent." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "You thought about that specifically," she said. "Yes," he said. She picked up the pen he had left lying on the papers nearest her. She turned to page 1 and initialed the margin next to clause 1. She moved to page 2 and initialed clause 2. She worked through the document steadily, clause by clause, initialing the margins with her neat, even signature. He watched her do this. She felt him watching, but did not look up. She reached page 4. She read clause 7 again. Then she turned to page 12. Below clause 12, above the signature lines, in the clear and small handwriting she had developed over years of keeping records that needed to be legible at a later date, she wrote, "Clause YI. In the event of the dissolution of this marriage, for any reason and by either party, all property acquired by the wife during the duration of the marriage shall revert exclusively and permanently to the wife. This includes but is not limited to any portion of the allowance as specified in Clause 4 that has been saved or invested. Any gifts, whether monetary or material, received from the Duke or any member of his family during the marriage. Any inheritance transferred from the Duke's estate or from the estate of any of his relations during the period of the marriage, and any property purchased in the wife's name during the marriage using funds from any of the above sources. No legal claim may be made upon any such property by any representative or heir of the Ashford estate following dissolution, regardless of the grounds upon which dissolution is sought, and regardless of which party initiates it." She initialed it and pushed the document back across the desk. He read it. He read it once. Then he read it a second time. Then he looked up at her. The room was very quiet. The fire had settled into a deep, steady burn. Somewhere in the house, a door closed with a soft, definitive sound. "You want a complete claim," he said, "on everything transferred to you during the marriage, even if the marriage dissolves." "Yes," she said. "That is a significant financial condition," he said. "Yes," she said. "So are clauses 3, 4, and 8. He looked at what she had written. He looked at her. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I would ask you to answer honestly, rather than strategically." "All right," she said. "Did you write this clause because you intend to dissolve the marriage once the financial transfer is complete?" he said. "I am not asking as an accusation. I am asking because the answer would change how I respond." Eleanor looked at him directly. "No," she said. "I wrote it because in my experience, a door that can only be opened from the outside is not a door. It is a room. I need to know that I can leave if I need to. That knowledge is the difference between being able to stay and not being able to." He was quiet for a long moment. She could not read what was moving through him, and she did not try. Then he picked up his own pen. He initialed the margin beside her additional clause. He signed the document with his full signature and pushed it back toward her. Eleanor picked up the pen and signed below his name. She had expected negotiation. She had expected a counter-proposal. She had expected, if she was honest, some form of resistance, pushback, a request to reconsider, a carefully worded explanation of why her clause was too much to ask. She had prepared 3 responses to 3 different versions of that conversation. She had not prepared for the possibility that he would simply sign. She was going to need to think about what that meant. They were married 3 weeks later on a Wednesday morning in a small stone church 3 miles from the estate, a church that had seen more Ashford marriages and funerals than it had probably wanted to, given the history of that particular family. The witnesses were Callum's solicitor, Fenton, a compact man with small, careful eyes who managed to convey his reservations about the entire proceeding through the very thoroughness with which he documented it. Eleanor's cousin Margaret, who had insisted on coming and had cried at a volume that suggested she was crying enough for everyone, since no one else was. The vicar, whose name was Mr. Hollis, and who conducted the service with efficient kindness, and the vicar's wife, who sat in the 3rd pew and cried quietly throughout, for reasons that appeared to be entirely personal and unconnected to the couple being married. Eleanor wore a gray dress that she had owned for 2 years, and which was, she thought, the most honest thing she could have put on. Weddings were occasions people dressed hopefully for, in colors that expressed their feelings about the future. She was not dressing hopefully. She was dressing honestly. Callum wore a dark coat and a new cravat. She could tell the cravat was new because it was slightly too stiff, the fabric not yet having learned the particular movements of the neck it was now responsible for accommodating. He had bought it specifically for this occasion and had not worn it beforehand, which meant he had not thought about breaking it in, which meant he was either not accustomed to planning the small physical details of his appearance or had not thought about this one, which was, she thought, a specific and minor and perfectly human kind of oversight. "I do," she said when asked. "I do," he said when asked. His voice did not waver. Hers did not either. They signed the register. He offered her his arm on the way out of the church, which she took without comment, because the vicar and his wife and Margaret were all watching, and some things were simply less complicated when you did them without making a point of deciding whether to do them. The carriage ride back to the estate was 23 minutes. Eleanor timed it not because she needed to know how long it was, but because it gave her something to do that was not thinking about all the ways the next several years could become complicated. "The household staff has been informed of your arrival," Callum said when they were approximately halfway back. "I know," Eleanor said. "Graves wrote to me last week with a summary of the staff roster. I have read it." He looked at her. "Graves wrote to you?" "I asked him to," she said. "I thought it would be better to arrive knowing something about the household rather than arriving knowing nothing." He was quiet for a moment. "Was there anything in the roster you had questions about?" he said. "A few things," she said. "We can discuss them after I have had a chance to meet everyone." He nodded. She nodded. The carriage arrived at the estate. Eleanor stepped out onto the gravel, looked up at the house that was now, in every legal and practical sense, her home, took a brief internal inventory of her feelings about this, which were complicated, but complexity was not the same as bad, and went inside to begin learning the geography of the next chapter of her life. Eleanor spent her first week at Ashford Hall doing what she always did when she needed to understand a new situation, which was to gather information systematically and without rushing. She walked every room of the house, not to admire it but to know it, to understand which windows faced east and would have morning light, which rooms had persistent drafts, which staircases creaked and where, which storage areas were damp and which were dry, which spaces had been used consistently and which had not been opened in so long that the air inside them had a settled, undisturbed quality. There were 31 rooms in regular use, not counting the attic, the servants' quarters, the cellars, or the glasshouse and garden buildings. She drew a floor plan from memory on the second day, walking the house again to verify it, and made small notes on it in pencil that she later transferred to a proper household management book she had purchased in Bath before leaving. The staff she met on her second morning. She had learned from Graves's letter that there were 14 staff at the main estate: the housekeeper, the cook, 6 housemaids, 2 footmen, a groom, a coachman, a groundskeeper, and a personal valet for the Duke, who went by the name of Harris, and who, according to Graves's careful and entirely neutral letter, had been with the family for 11 years. She went to each of them individually, or in the small groups in which they worked, and she introduced herself, and she learned names, and she asked 1 or 2 specific questions of each person that were designed to do 2 things simultaneously: to give her useful information and to let the person know that she was someone who paid attention. Mrs. Dunmore, the housekeeper, was a woman of perhaps 50, who had the particular quality of someone who had managed a large household for many years and had therefore developed opinions about how things should be done that were entirely correct and therefore did not require modification. Eleanor recognized this quality because she had a version of it herself. She treated Mrs. Dunmore with full professional respect and had no intention of overriding her on household matters without very good reason, and she said so, which she could see Mrs. Dunmore appreciated even if she was too professional to say so herself. Bet, the cook, was a small woman who was so clearly excellent at her work that Eleanor made the tactical decision on their first meeting that the most intelligent thing she could do was to make it completely clear that she would never attempt to interfere in the kitchen and then leave and not come back except when invited. This turned out to be exactly the right approach. The youngest housemaid, a girl of perhaps 16 named Nell, appeared to have an aversion to the downstairs bathroom that was strong enough that the other housemaid, her sister Maggie, had quietly redistributed the cleaning responsibilities so that Nell never needed to go in there. Eleanor noticed this arrangement and said nothing about it. Sometimes the most useful thing you could know about people was which things were not your business. Orwell, the head groundskeeper, was somewhere around 60 and had the look of a man who had been outdoors in English weather for so long that the English weather had simply accepted him as part of the landscape. He shook her hand with a grip that was entirely equal to hers and showed her around the kitchen garden with a thoroughness that suggested he had been waiting for someone to be interested in it properly. She asked about the glass house. He lit up. She asked about the cutting garden. He showed her everything. She liked him immediately. Callum she saw mostly at dinner, and occasionally in the mornings, when their routes through the house crossed in the hallways. He was at his desk by 7:30 every morning, and generally remained there until early afternoon. He managed the estate's finances and agricultural operations himself, with the assistance of his land manager Fletcher, a young man who was earnest and capable, and wore his collars in a way that suggested he was perpetually preparing for an interview. The estate accounts, which Callum showed her during the second week, not because the contract required it, but because she had asked and he had produced them without hesitation, were meticulous. He had a genuine competence for numbers and a land manager's understanding of the relationship between weather and harvest and income that was not something you could develop in a drawing room. They ate dinner together every evening. For the first 4 nights, she sat at the far end of the long dining table, which was the end that had presumably been set for her, and they shouted across 16 feet of white tablecloth when they wished to communicate, which was not often. On the fifth night, she moved her place setting to the chair nearest his. He looked at this without expression. She sat down. He sat down. They ate their soup. "The Northfield drainage problem," she said. After the soup, he looked up. "I heard you discussing it with Fletcher last week." The door to the study was open. A pause. "The Northfield has had a drainage issue for 3 years," he said. "A combination of soil composition and a secondary channel that runs at the wrong angle. Fletcher's solution is to redirect the channel before the ground freezes." "Will it hold?" she said. "Fletcher thinks so," Callum said. "I have some reservations, but they are not strong enough to outweigh his experience with the specific geography of that field. My father managed a farm in Somerset for 20 years, Eleanor said. Alongside teaching, he was the kind of man who needed to be useful in more than one way. And you? Callum said, with a quality of attention she was starting to recognize as being particular to him. Not performative interest, but actual interest, the kind that meant he was going to remember what she said. Yes, she said. That's why I'm here. He was quiet for a moment. He cut a piece of the roasted potato and ate it. What did you do? He said. Before the marriage? Before both marriages? I managed my father's household after my mother died, she said. I kept his accounts. I taught reading at the village school 3 days a week. I read a very great deal. And after the first marriage, I managed a different household, she said. Less successfully, by which I mean I was very good at the management, and the situation itself was not one that management could fix. She said it evenly, without particular weight. He received it the same way. I understand, he said. She thought briefly that he probably did. The library became important early, which she had not expected. She went there on the 11th day of the marriage because she had finished both books she had brought from Bath and had not yet had time to properly investigate the Ashford Library's holdings. She went at 10:30 in the evening because she had work to finish and finished it late and was not yet ready for sleep, and the library seemed like the right place to be. Callum was there. He was in a large chair near the fireplace with his shoes off and his legs extended on a footstool and a book open on his knee, and a glass of brandy on the table beside him that he had apparently poured and then forgotten about, because it looked untouched. He looked, she thought, more himself than he looked at any other time she had seen him, as if the version of him that existed in studies and at dinner tables and in the presence of solicitors was the public version, and this was the private one, and the private one was the one you needed to know if you were going to understand the first one properly. He looked up when she came in. He did not appear surprised, or if he did, he managed it very well. Eleanor went to the nearest wall of shelves and began reading Spines. The natural history section is on the east wall, he said after a moment. Agricultural texts are to the left of the window. History on the west wall. Fiction somewhat randomly distributed throughout, because my mother organized it by how much she liked each book, rather than by subject or author, and I have not seen any reason to reorganize it. Eleanor paused. Your mother organized this library? She spent 30 years doing so, he said. Eleanor looked at the shelves with different eyes for a moment. Then she returned to reading Spines. I am not specifically looking for anything, she said. I find it is better to let the library tell me what I want to read, rather than deciding in advance. He said nothing, which she took as acceptance of this approach. She found, in the following 30 minutes, a novel she had heard about and never had access to. A collection of letters written by an early cartographer about his experience mapping coastlines. 3 volumes of essays on subjects ranging from the philosophy of education to the history of salt trading, and a small book about the cultivation of roses in the English climate that she pulled out on instinct and then held on to. She sat down in the chair on the other side of the fire. He was already reading again. The fire burned quietly. The clock on the mantel marked the time in soft, even ticks. Outside, October moved through the estate grounds in the dark. They read for an hour and 40 minutes without speaking. When Eleanor finally stood to go upstairs, she realized as she reached the door that she had not been tense for the past hour and 40 minutes, and that this was something worth noting, because she had been tense in the evenings for a very long time and had grown so accustomed to it that she had stopped registering it as something unusual. She went upstairs and thought about it, for precisely long enough to file it away as information, and then went to sleep. She went back to the library the following Thursday. He was there. The Thursday after that, the same. They did not discuss it or arrange it. It simply became the thing that happened on Thursday evenings, and both of them continued to be extremely undemonstrative about the fact that it had become the thing that happened on Thursday evenings, which was, she was beginning to understand, rather characteristic of both of them. January arrived with a hard frost that lasted 2 weeks and a letter from London informing them of the death of Callum's uncle Gerald. Gerald Ashford had been 67 years old and had lived in Edinburgh for the entirety of his adult life in a house in the New Town with an excellent library and a disposition toward privacy that had apparently extended to his financial affairs, because the full scope of what he had accumulated over a lifetime of careful investment was not apparent until Fenton arrived from London in the second week of January to present the details in person. The details were considerable. Eleanor was in the small sitting room adjacent to the kitchen, working through the household accounts for December, when Graves appeared in the doorway to inform her that Mr. Fenton had arrived and was in the study with His Grace. She finished the column she was in the middle of. She had a rule about never stopping mid-column, because interruptions in accounting created errors that took twice as long to find as they would have taken to prevent, and then went upstairs. Fenton was standing when she came in. He said, "Mrs. Ashford," with the careful neutrality of a professional man who had very specific opinions about what he was looking at, and had no intention of expressing them in language, only in tone. Eleanor sat down. "Mr. Fenton," she said, "please continue with whatever you were explaining." Fenton explained. He was thorough in the way of someone who used thoroughness as a form of control. As long as he was talking, he was the one determining what happened and at what pace. He outlined the estate in Edinburgh, a townhouse in the New Town and a smaller country property outside the city. He outlined the investment holdings, which were primarily in shipping concerns and land in the Scottish borders. He outlined several smaller assets. He presented figures. The figures were substantial. Then he said, with great care, that there were certain complications arising from the specific terms of the marriage contract, particularly the clause. He said, and paused very slightly on the word, the clause appended to the document in what he referred to as a non-standard addition by the current Mrs. Ashford. Eleanor watched him say this. "In the event of dissolution," Fenton said, choosing each word as if it had been evaluated and approved by a committee, "this inheritance would, under the terms of the supplementary clause, constitute property transferred to Mrs. Ashford during the marriage, and would therefore be subject to the protections outlined therein." He looked at Callum. He looked at Eleanor. He waited. "I am aware of the clause," Eleanor said. "I wrote it." "Yes," Fenton said. "I am aware that you wrote it." The way he said this made his feelings about the fact that she had written it entirely clear without requiring him to actually express them, which Eleanor supposed was a kind of professional skill. "The clause is legally clear," Eleanor said. "It uses plain language specifically so that it would be clear. Is there a question about its interpretation? Fenton looked at Callum. Callum was looking at Eleanor. She looked back at him. His expression was not readable to her. Not in the way she had spent some months learning to read him. It was something she hadn't seen before, or hadn't seen applied to her. A quality of attention that was close and careful. "Thank you, Fenton," Callum said, without shifting his gaze from Eleanor's face. "We will discuss this and be in touch." Fenton departed with the specific dignity of a man who had said what he came to say and had absolutely no desire to witness what was going to be said next. The door closed. The room was quiet. The fire was burning well and had been tended recently. Callum set down the pen he had been holding. He had not written anything with it during the meeting, she noticed. He had simply held it. "The inheritance is significant," he said. "I understood the figures he presented," she said. "In the event of dissolution," he said, carefully, "you would be very well provided for." Eleanor looked at him. She thought for a moment about how to say the next thing, because there was a version of it that was true, but that was also, if said badly, unfair. She did not want to be unfair. "When I wrote the clause," she said, "I was not calculating forward to a specific inheritance. I did not know your uncle was ill. I did not know there was an inheritance to calculate toward." "I understand that," he said. "I wrote it," she said, "because I needed to know that the door opened from the inside. Not because I intended to leave. Because I could not stay anywhere. A door did not open from the inside. That is something I learned about myself at a cost I do not intend to repeat." He was very still. "I signed it," he said after a moment, "because I thought that was the right thing to do. Because it was fair. Not because any person who has been in a situation where the door didn't open from the inside deserves one that does." He paused. "Not because I calculated the risk and decided it was acceptable. Because it was right." Eleanor held his gaze. "I know," she said quietly. "That is why I was able to sign the rest of it." February was the hardest month. Eleanor had always found February hard. Not because anything in particular happened in February, but because it was the month that required the most faith. The faith that the cold was not going to be permanent. That the bare and frozen garden was only bare and frozen and not actually dead. That the long evenings and the stubborn gray light were temporary, rather than the world's final decision about itself. She walked in the gardens every afternoon she could, regardless of the temperature, because the cold was honest in a way that she found easier than the interior of the house on certain days. She wore a heavy coat and good boots, and she walked the same route most days, knowing it was good for the mind to have the body doing something predictable while the mind did whatever it needed to do. On a Saturday in the middle of February, she stopped walking. She was near the east wall of the formal garden, in the section furthest from the house, where an old rosebush grew against the stone. She had looked at it before. It was the kind of thing she noticed. Old plants, with complicated histories written into their structure. This one had not been properly attended for at least 3 years. The main canes were thick and healthy, which meant it was old and well established, but it had been allowed to overcrowd itself, and last season's dead wood had not been cut away, and the whole thing had a quality of having survived through stubbornness rather than care. Alive but not thriving, present but not well. She stood in front of it and looked at it. She was not thinking about the rosebush. Not really. She was thinking about a different February, in a different house, when she had been 23 years old, and had understood for the first time, with a clarity that was not dramatic, but simply very complete, that understanding a situation clearly is not the same as being able to do anything about it. She had been very good at understanding her situation then. She had been very good at managing, at being practical, at making the best of things. She had been good at all of those things, and none of them had helped, because the problem was not something that being good at things could fix. She gripped her own left wrist with her right hand. Not hard, just something to hold on to while she was somewhere that was not entirely this garden in this February. It was a habit she had had for years. She barely noticed it anymore. She did not hear Callum come through the garden gate. She did not hear him cross the frozen grass. She was only aware of him when he sat down on the stone bench 6 feet to her left, and she turned to look at him. He had a book. He had come out into a February garden in a heavy overcoat and no hat, with a book. And he opened it and began to read. She turned back to the rosebush. She stood there for perhaps another 20 minutes. The cold worked its way through her coat gradually, through her gloves. She became aware of things in sequence. First the cold, then the sound of the wind through the yew hedge at the far end of the garden, then the particular quality of stillness of the man sitting on the bench nearby, then the fact that her grip on her own wrist had relaxed without her noticing. Eventually she turned around and walked back toward the house. "It needs proper pruning," she said as she passed the bench. She did not stop. "Before March, or you will lose the year's growth. I will speak to Orwell," he said, without looking up from his page. Eleanor went inside. She stood in the hallway for a moment with her cold gloves still on and her coat still buttoned, aware that she felt steadier than she had when she had gone out. She was not sure what to do with this information except file it. She filed it, and then went to change for dinner. March came. The rosebush was properly pruned. Orwell did it himself, over 2 afternoons, and it emerged from the process leaner and better organized and ready for spring in a way it had not been ready for spring in several years. Eleanor told him it looked well. Orwell said it needed time and room. Eleanor said she thought most things did. Spring arrived in the estate the way spring arrived everywhere in England, slowly building its argument over several weeks and then winning it all at once, so that one morning you went outside, and the ground was soft, and the light had warmth in it, and the kitchen garden was showing green at the edges, and the world had decided to continue. Eleanor planted the glasshouse in the last week of March. She spent 2 full days doing it, with Orwell's assistance, and the conversation they had over those 2 days about soil preparation and germination timing and the relative merits of different varieties of climbing beans and the historic difficulty of getting late-season tomatoes to ripen in the English climate was, she thought, one of the more satisfying conversations she had had in several years. She told Callum about it at dinner. He asked questions. This was something she had come to appreciate about him, not the fact that he showed interest when she talked, because she had met many people who performed interest convincingly, but the specific quality of his questions, which were the questions of someone who had actually listened to what she said and wanted to know more about the parts of it he had not understood, rather than the questions of someone who was signaling that they had been paying attention. "Did your father have a kitchen garden?" he asked. "A large one," she said. "By necessity, more than choice. We grew most of what we ate. I learned to care about weather systems and soil types and which pests came in which season before I learned almost anything else." "That seems like useful knowledge," he said. "It has been," she said. "It is the kind of knowledge that translates." To what? She thought about this for a moment. To understanding that most things need more patience than you initially budget for, she said, and more room than you think they should need, and considerably less intervention than you feel the urge to provide. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with that particular quality of attention. "Are we still talking about kitchen gardens?" he said. "Mostly," she said. The trip to Edinburgh happened in May. The uncle's estate required attention, property inspections, meetings with the Edinburgh solicitors, the formal business of inheritance that required the physical presence of at least one Ashford. Callum asked if she would come. He said it in the specific way he had developed of asking her things, not as an invitation that would be declined without consequence, and not as a directive dressed up as an invitation, but as a real question, the answer to which he appeared to genuinely want to know. She said yes. Edinburgh was, as she had read it was, and had imagined it would be, exactly the right city. The new town was precisely laid out and very beautiful, and the old town climbed up the Royal Mile in a way that suggested cities, like people, carried their whole history in their structure, if you knew how to look. They spent 4 days there. The days were full of practical business, solicitors' offices, property walkthroughs, the review of account ledgers that required Callum's signature on approximately 47 individual documents, and the evenings were their own. They walked. They found a small restaurant in the new town on the second evening and ate a meal that was better than expected and talked with more ease than they had previously managed, which Eleanor attributed partly to being away from the estate and its routines, and partly to something that had been building between them over the preceding months, and that Edinburgh, being new to both of them, had given space to become visible. "Can I ask you something?" she said, on the walk back, while they were crossing the road near the gardens. "Yes," he said. "When the solicitor came in January," she said, "and it became clear what the uncle's estate was worth. Did you think I had written the clause with that in mind? That I had known somehow, or calculated it in advance?" He considered the question for a full moment before answering. "No," he said, "I did not think that. I thought, and I still think, that you wrote it for exactly the reason you said you wrote it. I know the difference between strategic and protective, and the clause is protective." "How do you know the difference?" she said. "Because strategic looks forward," he said. "It shapes a situation to get to a particular destination. Protective looks inward. It creates conditions that make the present bearable, regardless of what the future holds." He paused. Clause 13 creates conditions that make the present bearable. It doesn't point toward a destination. Eleanor walked for a moment in the Edinburgh evening. "You understand it better than I explained it," she said. "You explained it well," he said. "I just had some months to think about it." She looked at the lights in the Newtown windows. They were warm and gold, and very ordinary and very good. "Callum," she said. It was the first time she had used his name without any buffer around it. "Know your grace?" No, the arrangement required formality. Just his name. He looked at her. "I am better," she said, "than I was in October. I want you to know that, since it is partly because of circumstances you created. I am glad," he said. His voice was quiet and very even, and meant it entirely. They walked back to the hotel. The Edinburgh night was cool and clear. The moon was almost full. 3 weeks after they came home from Edinburgh, Eleanor came in from the garden one afternoon to find a plain-covered journal sitting open on the dining room table. She recognized that it had been left deliberately. It was positioned too centrally, too intentionally, to have been left by accident. She sat down and read it. He had divided a page into 2 columns. On the left, a capital C. On the right, a capital E. Under C, a list of what he had apparently believed at the beginning of the marriage about her. Under E, a list of what he had apparently believed she thought about him. Every assumption under C was wrong. She read them one by one and recognized in each one the shape of what someone might reasonably have assumed about a woman in her situation. A widow, with no money, agreeing to an arranged marriage, adding an escape clause to the contract. The assumptions were not unkind. They were simply not her. She was not the woman who had married him solely for security. She was not indifferent to the house or to him. She had not regretted Clause 13 after he signed it. She was not unhappy. She had been, for most of those first months, the opposite of unhappy, in a careful, watchful, not entirely trusting itself way, but the opposite of unhappy nonetheless. Every assumption under E was wrong too. She had not thought he agreed to the clause to avoid a scene. She had not thought he was indifferent to her presence. She had not thought, not for a single moment, that he did not notice things. She heard him in the hallway. She stayed where she was. He came in. He saw her at the table with the ledger, and stopped. "I thought you might see it before dinner," he said. "I did," she said. She looked up at him. He came to the table and sat down across from her. "Everything on the left side is wrong," she said. "I know," he said. "It took me a while to be certain, but I know. Everything on the right side is also wrong," she said. "I suspected as much," he said, "which is why I wrote it down. I needed to see it all in one place. All the things I had decided before I had the information to decide." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the dining room window, the June light was long and golden, and the kind of beautiful that happened reliably and still surprised her. "I did not marry you for security only," she said. "I know," he said. "I married you because the contract was honest," she said, "and because you did not look at me as if you were doing me a favor, and because you signed Clause 13 without making me justify it further than I already had. It was the right thing to do," he said. "I know," she said. "That is the point." He was looking at her with the full quality of his attention, the kind that left no part of the room elsewhere. "What did you think of me?" he said. "At the beginning, actually." She thought about how to be accurate. "I thought you were a careful person who had been managing something difficult quietly for a long time," she said. "I thought you were fair in a way that was not automatic but chosen. I thought the estate mattered to you more than the title, and the people mattered more than the estate, though you would never say it that way." She paused. "I thought you came out into the garden in February because you had seen something that required a response, and sitting nearby was the only response that seemed right." He was quiet for a long time. "You could have told me some of that," he said. "You could have asked," she said. "So could you," he said. She looked at the ledger. She looked at the 2 columns of things that had been decided before there was information to decide them, and had since been dismantled one by one, mostly by the ordinary evidence of sharing a house with another person and paying attention. "We are both people," she said, "who find the gap between knowing something and saying it considerably wider than it should be." "Yes," he said, "I think we are." "That could be a difficulty," she said. "Or," he said, "it could be something we are both now aware of and can therefore address." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "That is an optimistic interpretation," she said. "It is an accurate one," he said. June settled over the estate in the way that the best Junes did. Not dramatically, not insisting on being noticed, just very good and very present. The light lasting until 9 in the evening, and the whole property in the full, complete version of itself that all the other months were in some sense pointing toward. Eleanor was, she understood, happy. It was a word she applied carefully, having spent some years in situations where the word would have been a misrepresentation, and she applied it now only because it was accurate. Not loudly happy. Not happy in a way that required an audience. Happy in the specific, quiet way of someone who has been not happy long enough to have developed genuine respect for the alternative. She reorganized the glass house. She grew things in it that she had not grown before. She kept records. She found the foxes in the second week of June, a vixen who had settled in a sheltered spot near the kitchen garden wall. with 4 cubs that were at the stage of development where they were endearing rather than troublesome. She stood and watched them for 20 minutes the first morning, and made the decision on the spot that she was not going to tell Orwell, because Orwell was a practical and responsible man, and would do the practical and responsible thing, and the practical and responsible thing was not what she wanted done. She told Callum instead, at dinner, 3 weeks later, when it became clear that the cubs were going to be fine and the kitchen garden was not in fact being damaged. He put down his fork when she told him about the foxes. He said her name. She said, "They have cubs. They will be gone by September. The kitchen garden is not being damaged. Orwell will find out on his own eventually, and by then the cubs will be old enough that intervention will seem obviously wrong." He looked at her for a long, thoughtful moment. "If Orwell asks me about this," he said, slowly, "I will have no knowledge of any foxes." "That is all I am asking," she said. "It is not technically all you are asking," he said. "But all right." She smiled at him across the dinner table. She did not do this often. She was not a person who smiled readily, which was not a matter of unhappiness, but simply of temperament. And so when she did, she noticed that he noticed, and she found that she did not mind him noticing. July came with heat and long evenings, and the specific feeling of a summer that intends to be fully itself, and intends everyone present to understand that. Eleanor had spent the better part of July understanding something she had been carefully not fully articulating for some months. It was on a Thursday evening, in the library, that she let herself understand it completely. She was in her chair, he was in his. The fire was lower than usual because July did not require a serious fire, but they both came to the library on Thursdays regardless, and the fire was therefore lit at low intensity, out of habit, and the soft light it gave the room was the right light for this room at this hour. She had been reading, and then she had not been reading, and she had been looking at Callum instead, who was reading and was entirely absorbed in it. His coat off, his sleeves rolled up because the July evening was warm, his hair slightly disordered because he ran a hand through it when he was concentrated on something, his face in its private version rather than its public one. She thought, "I have fallen in love with this man." She thought it with the specific calmness of someone who has been watching a thing develop for months and has been careful not to name it prematurely, and who now names it because the evidence has become too organized and too complete to be given any other name. It was not a dramatic realization. It did not arrive with any particular urgency. It arrived like the spring had arrived, as the conclusion of a long accumulation of smaller things, each individually unalarming, collectively definitive. He had spent months being, in 100 small ways, exactly the person the signed contract had suggested he might be. Consistent, fair, present without demanding anything from his presence. The kind of person who fed the dogs from his plate and sat in February gardens with books and built ledgers to examine his own wrong assumptions, and looked at you when you were talking as if what you were saying was actually the most important thing happening at that moment. She had been paying attention all along. That was the thing about her, the thing she had known about herself since she was a child. She paid attention, and the information accumulated, and eventually it organized itself into something that had to be named. She named it. He looked up from his book. He found her looking at him, and he met her eyes, and he did not look away, because he was not that kind of man. "You are not reading," he said. "No," she said. He waited. "Callum," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think," she said carefully, "that clause 13 requires a companion clause, not a legal one. We have enough lawyers involved already." He put his book down. "I think," she said, "that I should tell you that the arrangement has stopped resembling an arrangement, and that I have been aware of this for some time, and have been waiting for the right moment to say so, and I think that Thursday evenings in this library may be as right as any moment I am going to find." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire gave its low light. Outside the library windows, the July evening was still luminous. "In Edinburgh," he said, "on the second evening, walking back to the hotel." He paused. "That was when I knew it for myself." "You might have said something," she said. "You might have too," he said. "We have established," she said, "that we are both people for whom the gap between knowing and saying is wider than it should be." "We have," he agreed. "I believe we also established that this is something we are now aware of and can therefore address." "You remember that conversation very precisely," she said. "I remember most of our conversations precisely," he said. "You say things that are worth remembering." Eleanor looked at him across the low fire in the July library. She thought about the contract on the desk in October, and the pen in her hand, and the 13th clause written in her small, clear handwriting, and what it had been, and what it had actually meant, and what it had found out when he signed it without hesitation. "Come and sit over here," she said. He got up from his chair and came and sat beside her, and that was that, and both of them understood that that was that, and neither of them required any further elaboration. September arrived, and with it, Fenton. He came, as he always did, with papers, because Fenton's relationship with papers was the most stable and committed relationship he appeared to have. He came about the Edinburgh estate, the formal transfer of the properties, the investment holdings, the last pieces of the inheritance that had required resolution. He had with him a series of documents that required Callum's signature, and, in some cases, Eleanor's. They met in the study. Eleanor had been in the garden with Orwell when Callum came to find her, and she came in with dirt on her gloves, which she removed and set on the hall table, and she sat down in the study and looked at Fenton with the calm expression of someone who found these meetings straightforwardly manageable. Fenton presented the documents. Eleanor reviewed each one that concerned her and asked 3 questions, 2 of which Fenton answered immediately, and 1 of which required him to look through his papers for a reference document. She noted this did not fluster him, which she respected. A solicitor who was flustered by questions was not a useful solicitor. They signed everything that required signing. Fenton gathered his papers. He prepared to leave. Then he stopped. "There is one further matter," he said, "of a somewhat different nature." He looked between them. "The original marriage contract," he said, given circumstances as they appear to stand." He paused. He was a man who chose his words as carefully as a person choosing stones to cross a river, and he had apparently run out of good stones. "Given that the nature of the arrangement has changed," Eleanor said. "Yes," Fenton said, with audible relief that the word had been provided for him. "Given that, you may wish to revisit certain clauses, as a formality, to ensure that the document continues to reflect, that is to say, to ensure that we have already revisited it," Callum said. Fenton looked at him. "I beg your pardon?" Callum opened the bottom drawer of his desk and produced the contract, the original, with the additional pages that he and Eleanor had written together on a Sunday afternoon in August at the kitchen table with a pot of tea and the window open and the late summer sound of the estate coming in from outside. He set it in front of Fenton. Fenton picked it up. He read it with the concentrated attention of a man for whom legal documents were the primary text by which he understood the world. He read the original clauses, the revisions, and then the additional pages, and then he read the 14th clause, which was at the end, in Eleanor's handwriting. He read it twice. He set the document down. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at Callum. He looked at the document. This final clause, he said, does not specify any particular legal obligation or right. No, Eleanor said. It does not. It is not, technically, a legally operative clause. Fenton said. I am aware of that, Eleanor said. I wrote it. It appears to be. Fenton stopped. An acknowledgement, Callum said. Fenton looked at him. It is an acknowledgement, Callum said, that the original purpose of the document no longer entirely describes what the document is about. We wanted that noted in a place where noted things are kept. Fenton sat with this for a moment. I see, he said, at last, in the voice of a man who is doing his professional best to see something that is quite outside his professional vocabulary. The rest of it is standard, Eleanor said. The financial arrangements and the major clauses. Those are unchanged. Only the language that was specific to the nature of the arrangement has been revised. Yes, Fenton said, gathering himself. Yes, I can see that. He straightened his papers. He looked at the document one more time. He put it with the other papers. Very well, he said. Is there anything else? There was not anything else. Fenton left on the 2 o'clock carriage, and Eleanor and Callum stood in the driveway and watched the carriage until it reached the bend in the drive and went out of sight, which neither of them usually did for departing visitors, but which seemed like the appropriate thing to do for this particular departure. Then they went back inside, and through the house and out through the kitchen entrance into the September afternoon, because Eleanor wanted to look at the south wall roses again, and Callum said he would come with her, and they went together, the way people go together, to look at gardens, when a garden is a place that belongs to both of them. September in the Ashford grounds was a particular and excellent thing. The quality of the light was different from every other month, lower and more golden, arriving at an angle that made everything look the way it looked in its best version of itself, and the estate at that angle and in that light had the quality of something that had been a long time becoming what it was, and had finally, very completely, arrived. The roses on the south wall were finishing their season in the way that good roses finish their seasons. Not abruptly, but gradually, giving you a reasonable amount of time to appreciate what had been there before it was gone. The section Orwell had cut in September was, Eleanor saw, exactly as he had argued it should be. And the roses were going to go into winter in good shape because of it. He was right, she said. He usually is, Callum said. They stood in front of the south wall in the September light. Eleanor thought about October a year ago. The gravel, the coat, the gray dress, the document on the desk, the pen in her hand. She thought about Clause 13, and what she had written, and why, and what she had been trying to find out by writing it. She had been trying to find out whether the door opened from the inside. It had. More specifically, the door had opened, and then she had stepped through it, and then she had found that what was on the other side of it was not the escape route she had built it to be, but simply a place where she was, where she lived, where she had set down the weight of everything she had been carrying for several years, and had, over the course of one October and one winter and one spring and one summer, largely left it on the ground. I was thinking, she said, not looking at him, looking at the roses, about Clause 13. What about it? He said. I thought it was the most important part of the contract, she said. When I wrote it, I thought it was the insurance, the thing that made everything else possible. And now, he said. She thought about this carefully, the way she thought about most things that were worth thinking about carefully. Now I think it was important, she said, but not in the way I thought. It wasn't the insurance. It was the test. I needed to know if you would sign it, and you signed it, and that told me something about you that took me the rest of the year to fully understand. He was quiet. "What did it tell you?" he said. "That you were not afraid of me having a door," she said. "And that is a rarer quality than it should be. In my experience, it is a very rare quality indeed." He looked at the roses. She looked at the roses. The light did what the September light did. "The door was not a difficult thing to agree to," he said. "Not for me. I looked at the clause and I thought, this woman has been somewhere where the door did not open from the inside. The least I can do is make sure this door does." Eleanor looked at him. "It was the least you could do," she agreed. "And you did it without being asked to make anything of having done it, which is considerably harder than it sounds." He reached over and took her hand. He did this now in the easy way of someone who is used to reaching for something that belongs nearby, without ceremony or announcement. She let him hold it in the same way, with the same absence of ceremony, because ceremony would have been wrong. It would have suggested the gesture was unusual, when the truth was that it was simply theirs. They stood in the September garden in the afternoon light. On the east side of the formal garden, the rose bush that had been bare and knotted in February was, by September, showing what it had become under proper care and adequate space. Full and well-shaped and in possession of its last dozen blooms of the season, which it was holding on to without any apparent urgency, in the way of things that had learned that there was no advantage in rushing toward an ending. The afternoon continued. The light continued. The estate continued, making its old sounds and its familiar movements around them, the way a place makes sounds around people who are finally, completely at home in it. Eleanor was home. Not in the way she had thought she might be, in October, when home had simply been the thing she was trying to acquire. In a way that was better than that, and different from that, and something she had not thought to put in the contract because she had not, in October, known that it was possible. You could not write a clause for this. There was no legal language for it. It was simply the thing that had happened, in the year between one October and the next, to two careful and private people who had paid attention to each other for long enough that paying attention had become something else entirely. She held his hand in the garden. The season moved toward its end at its own pace. The roses held on.